Good morning, class. This is, I think, my 13th take on this particular video, so hopefully we'll do it with everything correct this time. Okay, now up to this point, we have been working a little bit with Razor Pages, and we've been able to play and do some interesting stuff with those. We're going to take it a bit farther, and we're going to see what makes Razor Pages really appropriate for making dynamic websites. Now, I've given you a starter project, which is a simple ASP.NET web app using Razor Pages to display a database of movies. So we're going to walk through the different classes that are provided with that project. So the first I want to take a look at is this movie class. This represents a single movie in the database. Now, it looks pretty much like a lot of the other data classes we've worked with before. We have public getters and setters for the different properties. In this case, the title of the movie, the MPAA rating, that's if it's rated R, rated PG, and those are given by the Motion Picture Association of America. What genre the movie primarily is. We also have a couple ratings from the Internet Movie Database and the Rotten Tomatoes website. So these are ratings that help users decide if they want to watch the movie. So these are critical ratings. Now, the one thing we see here that we haven't seen before is this use of the question mark. That question mark in this context, where it's listed right after a value type like float, indicates that we want to take this value type and convert it into a nullable type. So nullable just means that we are adding the additional value of null to the possible values that that variable can represent. Now, normally with a value type has a set range of values and it cannot be null. And the reason for that is what null really means is that you have a reference that's not pointing anywhere. And value types are not reference types. They're memory is directly allocated, so when you use a float variable, you're looking directly at the memory of that float. By putting that question mark after it, what we're actually doing is we're wrapping that floating point number in an object. So we are now creating a reference that points to where that float is stored in memory, and because it is now a reference, that reference can potentially point at nothing or be null. So this is just a little bit of syntax that we sometimes need to use. In this case, we need to use it because this IMDb rating and this Rotten Tomatoes rating, not every movie in our database actually has one of those. So for some of them, it does need to be null. Now, we don't need to make these strings nullable because remember, a string is already a reference type, so a string can be null already. So we can just use those as they are. Let's talk a little bit about where we're getting the data for this movie class. And that's actually coming out of this movies.json file. Now, JSON stands for JavaScript Serialization Object Notation. So it is a serialization format, as the name might suggest. What a serialization format is it's a way of writing the data of an object to a file or to a stream so that we can send it across the network or so that we can save it on a hard drive. So it is a way of basically converting the in-memory representation of a variable to something that we can use in other contexts. And JSON, as the name suggests, is actually derived from JavaScript. That's where it originates. But it has become a very popular format for serializing data across pretty much every programming language that you could possibly be working with, in large part because it's integral to the web. So we'll see JSON a lot in your career, so you need to get used to it. And we'll walk through the syntax a little bit. So we have an opening square bracket and a closing square bracket. In JSON, that indicates an array or a list. So we have a list of something. And then inside of that, we have a comma delineated list of these curly brace blocks. So the curly brace in JSON indicates objects. So these are serialized objects. So we have a list of serialized objects. And then inside these objects, we see there are key value pairs, comma separated, and the key and the value are separated with a colon. And if we look at what the key actually is, that matches up to the property names in our movie class. So we have title and title, and the value is the actual title of the movie. So these actually represent properties, or at least that's how we're representing them in C#, and their values. And notice too, like I said, major genre here is null for this particular movie, so that data hadn't been added to this particular database. So some of these won't have that particular data. Now if we look back at our movie class and the JSON, you'll notice that there are more fields in this JSON than there are in our movie class. That's because I only pulled in the fields that I was primarily concerned with, but if we wanted to, we could go ahead and add additional fields, like say we wanted to bring the director in. All we'd need to do is come into our data class and declare an accessor with the same name. And the way that we're doing our serialization and deserialization will automatically pick up and add that director's name. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about how we're doing that serialization, deserialization. That happens in this movie database class. Now this is a static class, so all of its methods and all of its fields and all of its properties are going to have to be static as well, and we see that they are. And we have one static field, which is a private list of movies. We initialize that here. Now we need to actually populate it, and that's actually what we're doing here in our constructor. Now you may have not seen constructors with static classes before. In fact, you may have not even thought about it, because as you remember, we cannot create objects that are instances of a static class. With a static class, there's really only ever one instance, and we access it directly from the class name. So we'd say movie database dot and maybe something like dot all to get this property. But they can have constructors. They are static constructors, and they are run the very first time that we try to access that class. And once that's been run, it never gets constructed again, because that is the only copy of this object or instance of this object that will exist while our program is running. That's what the static means. Now you'll also notice that we don't have any access modifiers on this constructor, and that's because it doesn't really make sense to have an access modifier. If you can't create an instance of this class, if it only gets created for you, there's no reason to make it public, private, or protected. In fact, we can't set any of those. Even if we wanted to add private, that's actually considered a syntax error to have any access modifier on a static constructor. So what static constructors are largely used for is to initialize the fields of a static class. And indeed, that's exactly what we're doing in here. Notice that we have a using stream reader file equals system.io.file.opentextmovies.json. So what we're doing is we're opening up this file and saving it to this variable, and then we're reading the contents with this file read to end call, which gives us that entire JSON file as one long string, which we're saving in this JSON field here. Then we're invoking this JSON convert deserialize object to transform it into a list of movies, and we're doing that on that string. So that's going to create, by reading in that file and processing all of its data, the list of movies that make up our database, and assign that to this variable. And that is actually what our all property is going to be returning, is that exact list of movies. Now we are returning it as an IEnumerable of type movie rather than a list of type movie. An IEnumerable is just an interface that every collection in C# usually will implement. So the list does, arrays do, a lot of other collection classes do as well, and it just means that you can enumerate over those objects. So you can throw it in a for each loop or create an iterator from it. Now this JSON convert, you might be wondering where this comes from. This is actually from an external library. It's a third-party library that's created by Newtonsoft, and it's a very popular library, and we get that through the NuGet package manager. So if we open this up, NuGet is an online repository for developers to publish libraries that they have created that they want to share with the world. Some of these are open source, some are for sale. Newtonsoft is an or at least free, and I think it is open source as well, that I've actually preloaded into this project. You'll also notice that Microsoft is using using NuGet to actually disseminate a lot of their .NET Core libraries, and in fact a lot of their newer libraries are being shared out that way as well. So rather than installing them as components in Visual Studio, you can actually install this stuff from NuGet directly. So if you become a C# developer professionally, you'll probably end up using a lot of NuGet packages in your time. And we can always take a look over here in the dependencies. Notice this packages list contains all of that same information, which packages have been set up as dependencies of this project. Okay. With that in mind, let's go ahead and take a look at our index page. So this is our Razor page where we want to display our list of movies. Now right now it is just a default starter file, so we have this hello world. We probably want to change that to something a little more appropriate, like maybe movies, because this is a list of movies. Because it's a list, it makes sense to put it inside an unordered list, or potentially an ordered list, although our list of movies is not really sorted in any particular form or fashion, so an unordered list is probably a little more appropriate. And then we want to display, say, maybe the title of each movie. Now, if we were doing this in traditional web development, we would actually just add each title one at a time. So the first movie in our database is The Land Girls. And our second is First Love, Last Rites. The third is I Married a Strange Person. And we could just keep adding in every single one of our titles. But for now, let's go ahead and run it and see what that looks like. So there we have a nice simple list of those 3 titles under the header movies. Now we could go ahead and hard code the rest of our database in here like this. But there's a couple reasons we might not want to. One is every time we want to add a new movie to the database, that means we'd have to go back in and edit this page. And probably the more important reason is currently there are 2,601 titles in our movie database. And I don't know about you, but I do not feel the need to type out 2,601 titles. So what we want to do is actually leverage the power of Razor page templates. And that real power is the fact that we can embed C# code directly into our page. So if we were trying to print every single one of these in C#, we would probably think about using a for each loop. And we can do that directly in our Razor page. We just have to make sure that we preface any C# code that we want to execute with that @ symbol. So we are going to do a for each. And we're going to pull the movies directly from our movie database static class using that all method that we just looked at. Okay, so what this does is it will iterate through that database, and inside the body of this for each, we can just put arbitrary HTML. And for each pass through this loop, it's going to concatenate whatever this HTML is inside of this area where the for each is running. So it's basically going to add a list item for each movie in the database. Now, what we really want to show in that list item is the title. So we need to, again, use the @ symbol to say we're going to do a little bit of C#, and then we're going to use that movie variable and pull out the title from that. Now, if we run our code, we should see this for each iterate through and the result of that iteration, which is going to concatenate in the title that we just added. And there we have it. We have the first 3 that we already have looked at, and actually if we scroll all the way down, we have all 2,601 titles are now being displayed in this bulleted list. So that's the basics of iterating through a collection in Razor pages and appending that data to a page. Now we could stop there, but we have a lot of more information in that movie class, and it might be interesting to go ahead and show some of that. So let's go ahead and break this up a little bit, and we can also take advantage of the fact that in HTML we can have a lot of children. We can have an unlimited number, honestly, of children within any element. So it's a little different than the XAML WPF that we worked with, where most of our elements could only have a single child. HTML actually very happily accepts as many children as we want to throw in. So maybe we'll do the title and the MPAA rating, and the major genre. Now notice here that I'm putting these inside a div. All a div means is a division of the page. So we could use a paragraph tag or really any tag we wanted, but div by default really doesn't come with any special styling. It's just a block level element, so this is very commonly used for this sort of thing. So this is going to stack our title on top of our MPA rating on top of our major genre. Let's go ahead and run that. And we can see there's our list. But it doesn't look particularly good. There's this big space between our rating and the actual thing that we're rating, and we could really do some work to clean this up. And we would do that work normally with CSS. So let's go ahead and make a few changes that's going to make this a little bit easier to style. So first of all, I'm going to add some classes to our HTML. And we'll use classes instead of IDs because we're going to see a lot of these repeated multiple times. I'm going to call this MPAA. And our H3, let's go ahead and call that title and genre. So this just gives us some things we can attach to in our CSS. Now our CSS file that this site is using is actually located in www.root CSS and then site.css. And if we open up that file, we'll notice there's actually no styles in there right now. So let's go ahead and tweak that a little bit, and we'll go ahead and start with our unordered list. And we only want to be changing the unordered list that belongs to our movie list. Remember, this CSS can be used on multiple pages, so one of the easy ways of making sure we're only doing it to the UL on this particular page is by giving that a specific class that we can reference it by. And we don't actually need to have the UL because this is the only thing that has that class, but this is just a little bit more specific. It makes it clear that what we're styling is an unordered list. And I'm just going to remove any default padding that might be there and any default margin that might be there. And we're going to add a border to the very top of this unordered list. And I'm going to make that 1 pixel solid gray. So that's going to draw a nice line right beneath the word movies, right above our unordered list, and keep that looking nice and clean. I'm also going to tweak the list items in that list. I'm going to do that using the greater than syntax. What that means is any list item that is a direct child of the unordered list with the class movie list is going to get these rules applied. So we'll set the list style type to none. What that's going to do is remove the bullet that would normally be on the front of an unordered list. I'm going to also add a border just to the bottom, which is going to be a 1 pix solid, and I'm going to use a light gray for this one, so a bit lighter than the one that's at the very top. And I'm going to add a margin of 10 pixels all the way around this list item, so that's going to give us a little bit of spacing there. Now you might be wondering why, if we're going to take the bullet out, why would we even put this in a list to begin with? Why not just do one div after another? And the reason is really about the use of HTML. So what HTML is really for is for conveying the content, but also the structure. And by putting these items into an unordered list, we're signifying the items actually are a list. We're conveying some semantic meaning with the structure we use. Now remember, it's not just humans that read the internet. There's a lot of bots and algorithms and AI agents that do as well. And these usually aren't going to interpret and look at the CSS. So they're going to just look at the raw HTML, and putting it in that list helps them understand that this is actually intended to be a list. And that's part of the semantic web. If you want to learn more about that, it's a very interesting subject, and Lior actually does a tremendous amount of work and has some classes that he teaches in that, so that if you decide as an upper level undergraduate or even a graduate student that that's something you want to delve deeper into, he would be a good person to talk to. Alright, we're going to use a similar technique. Well, actually, we'll just go ahead and select our title directly using that class that we added. And for the titles, I'm going to set their color to a dark slate gray. And you can choose whatever colors you want. This just makes a nice kind of sharp and clean looking website. I'm going to set the font size to be just a little bit larger than the average font on the page. REM basically signifies the size the M character is in the primary font on the page, the body element. And that size would be 1 normally, so we're basically saying we want that to be 20% bigger, in this case with the 1.2. And I'm also going to remove the default margin. That margin is actually what was causing that big space between the rating, MPA rating, and the title. So this will make that text lay nice and flat against it. And finally, let's go ahead and change the color of the MPAA rating and the genre rating. And since I'm going to set them to the same color, I'm going to use the comma in the selector. This means that this block of rules is going to apply to both MPAA and genre selected separately. And I'll set their color to slate gray. And there you see we have our list laid out with the new styling, which looks a bit better. Okay. Now, while the MPA ratings convey the age appropriateness of a movie, the IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes ratings really provide us a sense of how much people enjoy the films. Since this is probably information our readers might want to know about, it'd be nice to call extra attention to those when we add those in. So what if we put them in boxes to the right side, opposite the title? Something like this might really convey what we're looking for. There's a lot of ways that we can accomplish that. We could, for example, make these float, have the property float so that they would float on the right side, and we'd have to declare them just before this title so that they would be in line with that. We could also do this with a table, where maybe we have a table cell here and a cell for each of these. And there's probably a few other ways I'm not thinking of as well. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to use one of the newer and more powerful CSS layout features, and that's Flexbox. We'll start by refactoring our HTML a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split these details into a separate div than our ratings. And inside those ratings, I'm going to go ahead and add the IMDb rating and the Rotten Tomatoes rating. Now, not all of these classes have an IMDb rating or a Rotten Tomatoes rating, so I may not want to display those. In fact, we already know that some of ours don't have an MPA rating or a major genre rating. Now, these ones didn't cause us any problem, because if that div is empty, it just collapses, so you don't actually see anything. But with our ratings, we want to surround that with a border, which means even when we collapse, we'll still see that border as basically a line. And that's not really what we want. So we're going to add a little bit of extra protection here using if statements and razor. So we'll just ask the question, does that movie IMDb rating actually exist? So is it not null? If it is, then we'll go ahead and render that div. And if it doesn't exist, because we've wrapped that in this conditional statement, this whole div won't actually be concatenated into the page, and it doesn't matter then if we have a border or other things that would show up if that was empty. And we'll do the same thing for the Rotten Tomatoes rating as well. Alright, now we're going to have to do a little bit of styling and add that in to deal with this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tweak this list item to use Flexbox. So we're going to set the display to flex instead of its default, which would be block. And that flex box, we're going to set up the direction we want it to flex to row. So Flexbox is similar to the stack panels that we've worked with in WPF. It can flow in row, column, or row reverse or column reverse. Well, we'll actually reverse the order of the items in that container. We're also going to justify the content. And remember, this particular Flex implementation, we have two divs inside this container. We want those to be at opposite sides of the container, so we're going to set this as space between. So all the extra space is going to be put between these two elements and push them to either side. We'll also align the items. So this is aligning them, and we want to align them to the top of the search result, or sorry, the list item. So we'll say flex start. We could also have centered them or aligned them with the bottom. There's a lot of different ways we can play with that. And then we'll also go ahead and set a minimum height for this element to be 50 pixels. And that just helps for those titles and movies that really only have the title. That's going to give us a minimum amount of space that they're going to take up, which is going to be more than that title would normally take. Then we're going to add a CSS rule for the ratings, and these we want to be putting in boxes side by side, so we're going to also set this to display using Flexbox, and we will set that flex direction to row. Alright, now just like we set up our MPA and genre together, we're going to set up the IMDb and the Rotten Tomatoes to have some shared styles. First is we're going to set the color to gray. We're going to set the border to 1 pix solid gray. We're going to set the width to 60 pixels. We'll do the text alignment to be centered. And we'll set the font size to be 1.2 RAM, so basically the same size as our title. It might be nice to also label those. I know in our mock-up we didn't have a label up above, but if you look, the IMDb rating is actually on a scale of 1 to 10, and the Rotten Tomatoes is actually on a scale of 0 to 100. So they have very different values, and especially if we only have one displayed, it would probably be good to know which is which. Also, there are a few movies in the Rotten Tomatoes ratings that are down in the region of 1 to 10, so we don't want people to confuse that with the IMDb rating, because a 1 to 10 on Rotten Tomatoes means that's a pretty stinky movie. So we could go back in and add those labels here in this div, but this is also a good chance to show off just how powerful the features of CSS are. So I'm going to show you another way we can use the IMDb. We're going to use the before selector, which actually creates a new tag in the page, a new element, and we can set that content to that tag to be something in here. So we're going to label this as IMDb, and we'll set its display to block, and we're going to resize this to be the normal size of the font for the page. We have to do that because this is actually ending up inside this IMDb, which is scaled up to 1.2 REMs. And we're going to do the same thing for the Rotten Tomatoes, except we're going to change the name here. I'm just going to use Rotten because we don't have a ton of space. And we'll save those changes. So if we go ahead and run this at this point, and there you can see we have our ratings showing up in a nice box, the IMDb or Rotten or both, and we also have the title and the rating, MPA rating, and it looks actually pretty nice. So So clearly CSS is a very powerful tool. Now it can be challenging to learn, but if you're going to be doing web development professionally or even as a hobby, it is well worth the time spent because you can do some really amazing things in making a web page look and behave incredible just by applying the right set of CSS rules. A couple places you might go to take a look at that. The MDN CSS documentation is excellent, and also the CSS Tricks website has a lot of guidance, especially for working with Flexbox and with grid and with different layout techniques and tricks. So those are some resources I would definitely suggest you take a look at. And that's all for today. So stay healthy and have a good one.